spending some time with us this Sunday morning. I appreciate you making time for us. We have Jack Spillane in the studio as well. Reflect
Jack, how
on
are you?
Hi, Scott.
reflect on Eddie Johnson's life and how you knew him. You know quite a bit about him and quite a bit of. Maybe you can fill in some dots here on how he got his political education.
Well, I first met Eddie back when I literally came to the city back in the late 70s, early 80s, and I ran into him just in day-to-day type of commerce, within the city, and I knew he was involved at the time. I think one of the time frames that I remember distinctly was when he actually had a citizen activist show out at UMass Dartmouth, which was SMU at the time. And I remember just hearing bits and pieces about the idea that he was posing issues that were important for people to be thinking about, had a point of view on most of them, and just beginning to become more of a public opinion formulator. I remember at the time speaking with him just about politics in the city in general, and realized that he had been tutored and schooled in some of the institutions that I was pretty familiar with, having worked within the Democratic Party structure beginning in January of '72. I became involved in Democratic Party politics. I was out at Marquette, Milwaukee, and knew the Wisconsin primary was going to be a big primary, and was in my last semester, and decided to get involved. And I ended up working for Humphrey, and I met an awful lot of people when I went to Washington that summer. And then when I was in Washington after that for about a 6-year period before came up to New Bedford, I met an awful lot of the people who Eddie actually had worked with. We knew an awful lot of the same people within the Democratic Party, within the AFL-CIO, within the civil rights movement. When I worked at the DNC, my job was basically integrating the Civil Rights Act into the Democratic Party rules and state statutes that concern selection of delegates to national conventions and parties, and party structure. So Bayard Rustin was someone who I was very familiar with, had been in meetings in which he was in, and I found out that Eddie was one of his, more or less an aide-de-camp to Rustin, and had worked with a number of the different AFL-CIO institutions that were involved in civil rights, and you couldn't get any more steeped in a institutional knowledge of what it's like to work within the system than working in places like that. And I knew Eddie had gone to a number of the different institutes they had and taken courses, and it was, there were contemporaries that Eddie was a little bit older than I, but there were contemporaries, people who were in either in the faculty or gone out to states, or what is now known as community organizers, that Eddie was very familiar with. And I realized that he had gotten a very, very good education. I knew he'd gone, hadn't gone to college, but I knew that many of the things that he was involved in were the equivalent of college or even graduate school type of institute. So I was very impressed with his pursuit of a higher education, even if it wasn't a formal education. And then he talked about some books and things he was reading and things he was familiar with, and I realized that this was not someone who was reading the newspaper and then came out with a position. He was really doing a lot of studying. I also knew at a very early point in developing a relationship with him that he knew what he didn't know, and he sought out people's opinion that he thought might have more information or more expertise than him. And I was very impressed with that, because having dealt with a number of people around the country who were involved at the street level, they were as deep as a veneer. They had a slogan, and that was it. And Eddie really was always out there seeking, more information and studying. And I think I saw at a pretty early time that he was beginning to develop a writing style and was trying to become a technical writer, because he was trying to go toe to toe with people or bureaucrats that had either developed or perfected the technical writing skills. So I thought that was very interesting. And then I saw that it came and boomeranged and would hit me on the head on a regular basis. And I heard as I was coming over Jack calling these letter bombs. I never thought of them in a negative way, because I always felt he was trying to push the envelope. He was always trying. He was the point on the argument, and I always felt that. And the reason I say this is because I always felt that what he was trying to do was make a point, make it fairly dramatically, make it technically enough that someone said, "Oh, geez, this is another Freedom of Information Act request. We got to deal with this fellow on." But I also thought that if you saw him 3 days later and you read this letter, you would go like, "Well, I guess next time I see him, he's going to be either extremely hostile to me, or I won't even get an acknowledgement." And then you'd see him, and it would be like a passing rainstorm. He still wanted the information. He absolutely was not going to back down on anything. But he also never, even though the letter might have been somewhat personalized, when you saw him, he was anything but personally antagonistic to you. I felt that I was trying to figure out ways to describe him, and I think he was honest. He was extremely tenacious. He had a wry sense of humor, and you can't say that about too many people, but I think it almost fit the definition. And he was also very self-deprecating. He knew what he didn't know, but he also knew that what he was advocating for had enough to it that it was worth continuing to pursue. So whether it was environmental justice issues, whether it happened to be education, which he was really involved with the last 15 years or so. And then this idea of African American participation in, and crucial participation in, the American Revolutionary War was something that I was not familiar with, that I found to be so interesting and so important in his life. And I remember in April of 2006, and it sticks out because I just was wet behind the ears as far as having taken office. He had me up at the Harvard Club, which I thought was such an odd thing. I'd been there once before for a friend of mine's wedding who had gone to Harvard and Harvard Law School. And I remember my only association with the Harvard Club was that his wife sang 2 sets with a full, kind of like Count Basie band. Never made any rounds to the tables, and I thought, I'm not sure if she married him because she wants to be married to him, or because she figured this was her breakout opportunity to sing with the Count Basie type band. So that was my association with the Harvard Club up until then, until this Sons of American Revolution luncheon banquet, in which Eddie played a prominent role, because they all sat there and said, we need this guy to explain to us things that we didn't know about. And it was his project in Plymouth, and it was his history, research that he had done on prominent African Americans and the Revolutionary War. And he was not only accepted, but he was revered. And I remember throughout this period of time, since 2006 now, so that's 11 years, whenever I run into members of the Sons of the American Revolution, or when I look at one of their events, he's heavily involved. The other thing that he did, which I thought was very, very interesting, was Peter Francisco was a Portuguese-American individual from Virginia who had ties to New Bedford, who was also a very prominent soldier within the American Revolution, in that his stature made him the equivalent of a half a dozen soldiers. The guy was, I think, I forget now, but 6'8" and 300 pounds. He could have played for the Patriots now. He'd be going to the Hall of Fame. Tremendous athlete. And basically, you'd put him out on the field, and this fellow, the battlefield, this fellow was able to make his name pretty quickly. And Eddie had done a great deal of research, and I remember going and dedicating the area over by the lighthouse when you first come in by the Octopus for Peter Francisco, and I know Eddie was heavily involved in that. So while you think of him as taking a stand on Keith and environment and the whole Parker Street issue, you think of him as being out there every day on education, he also was involved in trying to recognize the past, and I really love that about him. The last thing I'll say is I feel very badly for Anita. That's his lifelong companion, basically, and I know they loved each other very much, and it's very difficult when all of a sudden the person you see each day and count on each day is no longer there. So I know there's a tremendous loss. We feel the loss because we take it for granted that each of us is going to be there, and you're always going to be able to call Chris or Jack or Eddie and hear something. But it's it's a tough situation when when you're cleaning out the sock drawer. So I feel terrible about that. I also know he had a son he's very proud of, who was a detective down in New York City, and he was always worried about, and he appreciated police greatly. Eddie appreciated police greatly. Plus, he was a vet, so he appreciated our armed forces. There's a lot more there to Eddie Johnson than simply saying he was a citizen activist, which he was par excellence. The fellow was a very, very decent human being. When I first was elected, he took a real interest in my family. He was always tremendously courteous to Gig, as everyone was. But I mean, Eddie would go out of his way, make sure that if she was going someplace in my place, she got the full understanding. He would go out of his way to give my kids encouragement. I think he did that throughout the city in different ways. I keep hearing people come up to me and say, well, Eddie Johnson was a good friend of mine, and I say, I didn't realize that. I apologize for not realizing that. I should have known more about that. The last thing, I said the last thing, but I will say one other thing, and this will show you how important I thought he was to the city. I put him on the WIB board within the first month or so that I was elected, and maybe 2 months. And I had a very prominent person that I respected and who I liked call me and say, if Eddie Johnson goes on the WIB board, I just want to let you know right now, I'm off the WIB board. And I basically said, I find that to be counterproductive, counterintuitive on your behalf, but just send me a resignation, because there's no way in hell Eddie Johnson's coming off the WIB board. And it wasn't because Eddie Johnson was going to be the next great WIB expert, but it was that Eddie Johnson and Eddie Johnson's sons need to be represented throughout our governmental structure.
Absolutely. Hey, we've been chatting here with Scott Lang, former mayor of New Bedford, who's remembering our friend Eddie Johnson. We're up against a hard break, Scott. But if there was one thing you remember the most about Eddie in just a quick 30 seconds, what would that be?
Getting very emotional when Brian Woolley passed away. Right. Feeling that he had a real ally in Hands Across the River in Buddy Andrade and Old Bedford, and knew he wasn't doing anything alone. And then sending one of these letter bombs complaining about the slow pace of Parker Street, and having the EPA go in there basically because of this tenacity of Eddie, and hire a lawyer to represent Clean against the EPA and the city to look over our shoulder on everything we're doing. And while I at the time said tremendous waste of taxpayer money, because we're doing everything we possibly can, I love the idea that he had he had the guts to say, you know what, Scott, I'm 100% for you, but I want everybody to check every dot and T here. So I love the guy. I saw him 2 weeks ago, and he told me, I'm gone. Right. And I remember didn't sit well, and also that's the kind of thing where you say, hey, no, you're not going anywhere. And then it becomes a reality, and you just feel this tremendous loss.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us, Scott, this morning. Thanks for taking some time out. We have to take a quick break. That was former mayor of New Bedford, Scott Lang. We'll be right back. New Bedford.